The letter landed on the table between them like a loaded weapon, and Marcella Finley watched Vernon Monroe's jaw go tight as iron the moment he recognized his own handwriting on the envelope she'd slapped down in front of him. 52 letters, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more devastating than a shout. 52 weeks, Vernon. I wrote to you every single one of them. Every Sunday night, after the lamps burned low and the whole town of Caldwell went quiet, I sat at that table and I poured everything I had onto paper. My fears, my hopes, what I'd planted in the garden, what your father said to me when he thought I wasn't listening, what I dreamed about when I finally let myself dream. Vernon's hands were flat on the scarred surface of the bar, and he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at that letter, the one letter he had finally sent lying between them like a confession and a grenade all at once. And you read them, she continued, because she needed him to understand the full depth of the betrayal she felt cracking open her chest. Every single one, twice. Your father told me, Vernon. On his deathbed, with the last honest breath in his body, Eldridge Monroe told me that you kept every letter in a tin box under your bunk, and that you read each one of them twice before you tucked it away. Twice. Like they were something sacred to you, like I was something sacred to you. Her voice broke on that last word, and she hated herself for it. And yet not one word came back, not in 12 months, not a single syllable, until this. She tapped the letter. This showed up in my mailbox 3 days after your father died, 3 days after the man who arranged everything between us was cold in the ground. You couldn't write to me while he was alive, but the moment he was gone, suddenly you found your tongue. Vernon Monroe finally lifted his eyes to hers, and what she saw there was not what she had expected. It was not guilt exactly. It was something older and more complicated than guilt. Something that looked disturbingly like a man who had been carrying a secret so heavy it had bent him sideways for an entire year, and the weight of it was still pressing down on his shoulders even now. Marcella, he said, and the way he said her name, like it cost him something, like it was the first word he'd spoken aloud in a month, stopped her cold. But she was not ready to be stopped. Because to understand what had brought Marcella Finley and Vernon Monroe to this moment in the Dusty Rose Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, you had to go back to the beginning of it all, to the first letter, to the morning she'd arrived in town with 2 trunks, and a heart full of terrified hope, not knowing that the man she'd come to marry was keeping a secret that could destroy everything she thought she'd been building for herself in the wild, untamed West. Marcella had come from Cincinnati, Ohio, in September of 1881, which meant that by the time she arrived on the westbound train at the Caldwell Depot, she had already spent 3 weeks reading every pamphlet and correspondence guide she could get her hands on about the territory of Kansas and the cattle trade that defined its borders. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a failed tailor and a schoolteacher mother who had died of fever when Marcella was 17. She was educated, practical, and possessed of a stubbornness that people in Cincinnati had often mistaken for coldness, though the truth was simply that Marcella Finley had been forced to grow a very thick exterior to protect what was, in fact, an extraordinarily tender interior. She had answered an advertisement placed in the Cincinnati Gazette by one Eldridge Monroe, patriarch of the Monroe cattle operation outside Caldwell, seeking a schoolteacher and potential bride for his son, Vernon Monroe, aged 28, a man the advertisement described as hardworking, capable, and in need of a woman of strong character and good sense. What the advertisement had not mentioned was that Vernon Monroe himself had not been consulted about the arrangement. The revelation of this particular secret had come to Marcella in stages, the way most terrible revelations do, not all at once in a single crushing blow, but in small, quietly damaging increments that she kept excusing and explaining away, because the alternative was to admit that she had upended her entire life and traveled 2,000 miles for a man who did not know she was coming. She had stepped off that train in September of 1881 to find Eldridge Monroe waiting on the platform with his hat in his hands, and a look on his weathered face that she recognized immediately as the look of a man who had done something he wasn't entirely sure he could justify. He was perhaps 60, lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of posture that spoke of decades spent on horseback, and his handshake was firm, and his eyes were kind even when they were guilty. "Miss Finley," he'd said, "I'm glad you made the journey. I want to tell you before we do anything else that my son doesn't know you're coming. I want to tell you that plainly because you deserve plain dealing." Marcella had stood on that platform with her two trunks and the dust of the Kansas plains already settling on her shoulders, and she had looked at this old man with his guilty eyes and his firm handshake, and she had said very quietly, "Then why did you advertise for him?" Eldridge Monroe had the grace to look genuinely pained. "Because Vernon would never advertise for himself. He's been alone since his mother passed 4 years ago, and since the trouble with the Hargrove Ranch, well, he's built himself a very high wall, Miss Finley, and I am an old man who knows he doesn't have many years left to see his son happy. I thought if he met someone, truly met someone, not some arrangement he'd been pushed into, he might find his way through." "So you pushed him into it without telling him," she said. "I brought you here so that he could meet you. What happens after that is between the two of you." It was, she thought, an extraordinarily convenient distinction. But she had come 2,000 miles, and she was not the kind of woman who turned around when faced with inconvenience. So she had taken the situation in hand with the same focused practicality she applied to everything else in her life. And she had accepted Eldridge Monroe's offer of employment at the one-room schoolhouse in Caldwell, which genuinely needed a teacher since the previous one had married a rancher from Wichita and departed in July. She had settled into the small clapboard house the town kept for its teachers, 2 rooms with a lean-to kitchen and a garden that had gone to riot in the late summer heat, and she had made herself useful, and she had waited for Vernon Monroe to come to town. He had come on a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks after her arrival, riding in from the south with 2 other ranch hands to bring a consignment of beeves to the cattle pens on the south end of Caldwell. She had been at the general store, purchasing ink and paper, when she first saw him, and the sight of him had done something entirely unexpected and inconvenient to her carefully organized interior. Vernon Monroe was tall, though not extraordinarily so, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than performance, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else. He had dark hair that was too long by the standards of Cincinnati, and hadn't been cut since probably the previous spring, and his face was the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and time into something that was not conventionally handsome, but was absolutely impossible to look away from. He had strong, even features and dark eyes that moved across the street with a watchfulness that was not paranoia, but simply the habit of a man who had learned the hard way to pay attention to his surroundings. He had not noticed her. This was, in retrospect, both appropriate and entirely typical of the situation. She was noticing him with enough intensity to compensate for both of them, and he had ridden past without a glance, his attention fixed on the cattle ahead and the work in front of him, and Marcella Finley had stood on the boardwalk outside the general store and had thought, with great clarity, that this was going to be considerably more complicated than she had prepared for. She had met him formally that evening, at a supper Eldridge Monroe had arranged at the hotel, which was the closest thing Caldwell had to neutral ground. The introduction had gone poorly in the sense that Vernon Monroe had realized within approximately 3 minutes what his father had done, and the look that had crossed his face in that moment was one of the most carefully controlled expressions of betrayal Marcella had ever witnessed. He had not made a scene. He had been perfectly polite. He had spoken to her with courtesy, and even a certain gruff warmth that she suspected was his natural register when he wasn't actively furious with his father. But then supper had ended, and he had left, and the next day he had gone back to the ranch, and a week had passed with no word. It was during that first wordless week that Marcella had made the decision that would define the next year of her life. She was not going to simply wait and hope and dwindle away in uncertainty. She was not built for passive suffering. She was a woman who believed that honest communication was the foundation of any meaningful relationship. And if Vernon Monroe was too locked behind his walls to come to her, then she would come to him in the only way she had available, through words on a page, carried by the weekly mail rider who made the circuit between Caldwell and the outlying ranches every Sunday. She had sat down on a Sunday evening in October of 1881, with her lamp burning and the prairie wind pressing against the windows of her little clapboard house, and she had written the first letter. It was not a love letter, not yet, because she did not know him well enough to love him, and she was too honest to pretend otherwise. It was an introduction, almost, a more truthful version of the evening at the hotel, because on paper she could say the things that the formal atmosphere of that supper had made impossible. She told him that she understood his anger at his father's manipulation. She told him that she was not under any illusion about the nature of the arrangement that had brought her here. She told him that she had no intention of leaving Caldwell simply because he hadn't welcomed her arrival, because the children of this town needed a teacher, and that was a real and genuine need that she was capable of filling, and she intended to fill it regardless of what happened between the two of them. And then she told him one true, personal thing, because she felt that the letter needed at least one moment of genuine vulnerability. She told him that she had never been anywhere as beautiful as the Kansas plains at sunset, that she had stood at the edge of the schoolyard the previous evening and watched the sky turn colors she didn't have names for, and that for the first time since she'd left Cincinnati, she had felt something that might, eventually, become belonging. She folded the letter, addressed it to Vernon Monroe, Monroe Ranch, and gave it to the mail rider on Sunday morning. No reply came. She wrote again the following Sunday. This time she described the children in her schoolroom, 14 of them ranging from age 6 to 15, and she described them with the kind of detail and affection that revealed how fully she had given herself to the work. There was Tommy Bricker, 8 years old, who could not sit still, but who had memorized every multiplication table through 12 without ever seeming to try. There was Clara Holt, 13, who wanted desperately to learn to read more advanced texts, and whose parents thought that sufficient education was wasted on girls, an injustice that Marcella was addressing with quiet persistence. There was little Samuel, only 6, who arrived every morning with dust on his boots and a solemn expression that broke into something wonderful when he finally understood a new thing. She wrote about the children because they were real and present and she loved them already, and because she thought that a man who had grown up on this land ought to know the names of the children who were growing up on it now. No reply came. The third letter, written in early November, was longer and more personal. A blue norther had come down from the Panhandle and hit Caldwell like a fist, dropping the temperature 40 degrees in 6 hours. And Marcella had spent the first night of it huddled by the small iron stove in her front room with every blanket she owned piled on her lap, trying to grade papers and failing because her fingers were too cold to hold a pencil properly. She wrote about this with a dry humor that was, she admitted to herself, partially designed to make him laugh, because she had a suspicion, based on nothing more than instinct, and the one evening she'd spent in his company, that Vernon Monroe had a sense of humor that he kept buried under about 6 feet of protective reserve. She told him she had also written to a judge in Cincinnati asking about the legal standing of advertised bride arrangements in the territory of Kansas, partly to make him laugh and partly because she genuinely wanted to understand her own situation. She told him that his father had visited the schoolhouse that week and had sat in the back row during arithmetic and had looked enormously pleased with himself, and that she had conflicting feelings about Eldridge Monroe that ranged from genuine gratitude to something that bordered on exasperated admiration. She told him that she was not going to stop writing, and she did not stop. What Marcella did not know, during those long weeks and months of silence, was that each of her letters was reaching Vernon Monroe in the most complicated possible circumstances. The first letter had arrived on a Monday in late October, delivered by the mail rider along with a bill from the feed store and a notice from the county land office. The ranch hand who had brought in the mail had left it on the kitchen table, and Vernon had come in from the eastern pasture at dusk to find it sitting there, that neat envelope with the precise, educated handwriting, addressed to him in a hand he didn't recognize. He had stood at the kitchen table for a long moment before he picked it up, turning it over in his hands, noting the Cincinnati postmark that had been partially obscured by handling. He had known, of course, who it was from. There was only one person in his life at that moment who would be writing to him from anywhere. The woman his father had imported like a piece of furniture. The woman who had appeared at that disastrous supper, with her clear gray eyes and her absolute composure, and her quietly devastating way of making him feel seen by someone who had no right to see him yet. He had opened the letter standing at the kitchen table, still in his coat, dust from the eastern pasture settling off his shoulders onto the floor. He had read it once. Then he had sat down heavily in the nearest chair and read it again. The thing that undid him was not the passage about the sunset, though that had struck him somewhere genuinely vulnerable, because he knew exactly which sunset she was describing. He'd watched 1,000 of them over the same stretch of prairie and felt that same nameless thing she was reaching for with her limited vocabulary of belonging. The thing that genuinely undid him was the passage about his father's manipulation, because she had described it with such precise and unflinching fairness, acknowledging both the wrong done to him and the understandable human motivation behind it, without excusing either, and he had never, in his entire life, had someone speak about one of the most painful situations he'd endured with that combination of clarity and kindness. He had put the letter back in the envelope. He had not replied. This was not, as Marcella had assumed, because he was cold or indifferent or dismissive. It was because of the dark past and the hidden truth that had been driving Vernon Monroe's behavior for the past 18 months, a secret that his father knew and had apparently decided not to disclose to the woman he'd brought out from Cincinnati, a secret that Vernon had been living inside like a man trapped in a burning building who couldn't find the door. 18 months earlier, in the spring of 1880, Vernon Monroe had ridden into the town of Dodge City on business, the sale of 60 head of cattle to a buyer who'd come up from Texas. The business had concluded without incident. The trouble had begun afterward in the saloon, when a man named Dalton Hargrove, son of the rival Hargrove cattle operation, had accused Vernon Monroe of cheating at cards. The accusation had been false. It had also been spectacularly, terrifyingly well-timed, because Dalton Hargrove had come into that saloon with 2 hired men and the express intention of engineering a confrontation that would give him grounds to ruin the Monroe family name. The confrontation had escalated in the way confrontations did when one party was determined to make it escalate. There had been a fight. In the fight, a man had been shot, not by Vernon, but by one of Hargrove's hired men in the chaos, a bystander who had nothing to do with any of it. The bystander had survived, but the incident had been reported to the sheriff's office with Dalton Hargrove's version of events, which placed Vernon Monroe at the center of the violence. Vernon had not been arrested, because there were witnesses who contradicted Hargrove's account, but the incident had been hanging over him ever since, unresolved, with Hargrove continuing to press the matter through every legal and extra-legal channel available to a man of some means and considerable spite. There was a possibility, a genuine, credible possibility, that formal charges might still be brought. Vernon's lawyer in Wichita had been telling him for 18 months that the situation was delicate and that the worst possible thing he could do was acquire additional hostages to Fortune, things that Hargrove could threaten, leverage, or use against him. A woman who had come 2,000 miles on the strength of an advertisement was exactly the kind of hostage to fortune that Dalton Hargrove would use without hesitation. This was why Vernon Monroe had not replied to Marcella Finley's letters, not because he didn't read them, not because he didn't feel them, but because every week that she wrote to him, he read her words and he thought about what Hargrove could do to her if he knew she existed, and the thought was enough to seal his pen and hold his silence, even as the letters stacked up in his tin box like a testament to everything he was not allowing himself to have. He read each one twice, because once was not enough to hold everything she put in them. He read each one twice because she was, week by week, becoming the most honest and genuine person in his life, pouring herself onto those pages with a courage that made his chest ache. And he read every word twice to make sure he understood it completely, to make sure he didn't miss anything, because he was storing all of it away in the locked room inside himself where he kept things he couldn't afford to have and couldn't bring himself to lose. The letters changed as the months went on. They grew deeper, more revealing, more intimate in the way that letters between people who never speak in person can become intimate, because there is no social buffer, no awkwardness, no silence to be managed, just words and the space between them. Marcella wrote about her mother, who had been the most important person in her life and whose death had left a shape in the world that Marcella had been moving around for 7 years. She wrote about her father, whose tailoring business had failed not from incompetence, but from his complete inability to charge people fairly for his work, a man so soft-hearted he had essentially given himself out of business. She wrote about Cincinnati in the winter, how the river froze and the smoke from 1,000 chimneys lay in a low gray ceiling over the city, and how she had always felt a pressure there, as if the city itself was pressing on her from all sides. She wrote about Caldwell in the winter, which was something else entirely, wild and open and terrifying and magnificent, the sky so enormous it seemed to press the flat earth down rather than containing it. She wrote about the first time she'd heard a coyote at night, convinced for approximately 4 seconds that she was about to be killed, and the way the sound had eventually become familiar and then comforting, a voice in the dark that said something she was slowly learning to understand. She wrote once about seeing him from a distance when he came into town in December to pick up supplies from the hardware store. She had been at the schoolhouse, and she'd seen him crossing the main street through the window, and she had watched him without his knowledge, which she acknowledged freely was a thing she probably shouldn't admit, but she was committed to honesty in these letters, and so she admitted it. She wrote that he walked like a man who was very tired but would never say so. She wrote that she had wanted to go outside and speak to him, but had decided against it because she didn't want him to feel ambushed, and that the decision had cost her more than it should have for someone who had received absolutely no encouragement that her interest was reciprocated. That letter, the one from December, was the one Vernon had to put down after the first reading and walk outside and stand in the cold night air for 10 minutes before he could go back inside and read it again. The trouble with Hargrove came to a head in February of 1882, 5 months before Eldridge Monroe's death and 7 months before Marcella Finley confronted Vernon in the Dusty Rose saloon. It came in the form of a letter from Vernon's attorney in Wichita, informing him that Dalton Hargrove had found a new witness, a man who claimed to have seen the fight in Dodge City in the spring of 1880 and was prepared to testify that Vernon Monroe had been the instigator of the violence. The attorney's letter was carefully worded and professionally measured, but the message beneath the careful words was clear. The situation had become significantly more dangerous, and Vernon needed to be in Wichita within the week. Vernon had gone to Wichita in February with snow on the ground, and the feeling of a man riding toward a judgment he had been postponing for too long. He had spent 2 weeks there, meeting with his attorney, dealing with depositions and affidavits and the grinding machinery of territorial legal process, and at the end of 2 weeks the news was mixed. The new witness had been partially discredited, enough to prevent immediate charges, but not enough to close the matter entirely. It was going to continue to hang over him for months more, unresolved, an open wound. He had come back to the ranch in late February and found 3 of Marcella's letters waiting for him, the ones he'd missed while he was in Wichita, and he had sat at the kitchen table and read all 3 of them, twice each, and then sat there for a long time in the quiet of the ranch house and thought about the life he was refusing himself. In March's letter, Marcella had written about a conversation she'd had with a woman named Ruth Alderman, the wife of the town's only doctor, who had become something close to a friend. Ruth had told her, gently and kindly, that Vernon Monroe had been keeping to himself for almost 2 years, and that people in Caldwell generally believed there was something troubling him that he hadn't shared with anyone. Marcella had written that she didn't know what it was, but that she had come to believe, based on a year's worth of observation from a safe distance, that Vernon Monroe was not a man hiding from intimacy because he didn't value it, but a man who valued it precisely enough to be terrified of it. She wrote that she understood the distinction because she recognized something of herself in it. She wrote that she was still not going to stop writing. In April, she had written about the prairie in spring, which was a different thing entirely from the prairie in any other season. The way the grass came back green after the winter burn, and the wildflowers came up in colors that had no equivalent in Ohio, and she had pressed a small blue wildflower between the pages of the letter, flattened and dried, because she wanted him to have it even though she knew she was probably writing to a man who was never going to respond, and that was a kind of madness she had decided to embrace anyway. Vernon had kept the pressed flower separately from the letter. He had put it between the pages of the almanac he kept on the kitchen shelf, which was the one book he consulted regularly enough that he'd know it was safe. In May, she had written about trouble at the school. A family named Driscoll had pulled their 3 children out of her classroom and lodged a formal complaint with the town council, objecting to the fact that Marcella taught the children of the 2 black families in Caldwell alongside the white children, which was how she believed a school ought to function, and which she had no intention of changing. The town council had been divided on the matter, and there had been a meeting that Marcella described with barely contained fury. She had addressed the council directly, she wrote, and told them plainly that she had been hired to teach all the children of Caldwell and that she intended to do so, and that any council member who wished to fire her over it was free to make that decision and live with the consequences. The council had not fired her. The Driscoll children had not returned, but the other 11 children had stayed, and Clara Holt's parents had, somewhat surprisingly, spoken in her defense, which Marcella called both unexpected and deeply moving. Vernon had read that letter twice and then a 3rd time. There was something about a woman standing up in front of a hostile council and saying that she intended to do what was right and to live with the consequences that resonated with him in ways he didn't have language for. In June, she had written about Eldridge Monroe. This was the letter that had genuinely frightened Vernon, because it was the first indication he had that his father's health was worse than the old man had been letting on. Marcella wrote that she visited the ranch every 2 weeks to have Sunday dinner with Eldridge, a habit they had fallen into over the winter, and that she had noticed in recent visits that he tired quickly, and that the color of his skin had changed in a way that worried her. She had encouraged him gently to see Dr. Alderman, and Eldridge had laughed and said there was no point in consulting a doctor when a man had already made his peace with what was coming. She wrote that she found Eldridge Monroe infuriating, dear, and heartbreaking in approximately equal measure, and that she could not bring herself to be fully angry at him for the original deception, because he was quite clearly a man who had loved his son with more ferocity than wisdom, and she recognized that as a form of love she could understand even when she couldn't excuse it. Vernon had ridden into Caldwell the day after he received that June letter. He had not gone to the schoolhouse. He had gone to the Monroe Ranch, his childhood home, and found his father thinner than he'd been in March, sitting on the porch in the morning sun with a cup of coffee and a look of serene acceptance that made Vernon's throat close. They had talked, really talked, for the first time in a long time. Eldridge had told him that he had maybe 6 months, that it was his heart, that Alderman had known since January and had been keeping him comfortable and informed. And then, because Eldridge Monroe had never been a man who wasted his remaining time on anything less than the truth, he had looked at his son and said, "That woman writes to you every week. Are you reading her letters?" Vernon had said yes. Eldridge had said, "Then you know she's the real thing. Vernon, whatever it is you're protecting her from, I want you to think hard about whether the protection is worth what you're paying for it." Vernon had not answered that directly. He had stayed for dinner, and he had helped with the evening chores because his father's ranch hands were good men, but there were things that a son's hands needed to do, and he had ridden back to his own spread in the dark, turning his father's words over and over in his mind. In July, Marcella's letter had been shorter than usual, and the brevity itself had been a message. She had written that she was well, that the school year had ended, and she was spending her summer preparing materials for the fall term. She had written that she'd had an offer of marriage from Thomas Carraway, who owned the hardware store and was a perfectly decent man of about 42 who had been widowed 2 years earlier. She wrote that she had declined the offer, and that she was writing this not to create pressure or to manufacture a crisis, but simply because she had made a commitment to honesty in these letters, and this was an honest account of her life. She had declined Thomas Carraway because she was not in love with Thomas Carraway and she had too much respect for herself, and for him to accept a marriage built on convenience alone. She hoped this was the right decision. She admitted that there were moments when she genuinely wasn't sure. Vernon had read that letter 5 times, not twice, 5. The first read had hit him like stepping through ice into cold water, and by the 5th read, he had been sitting at the kitchen table in the dark because he'd forgotten to light the lamp, and he had made a decision that he then spent 6 more weeks talking himself back out of. In August, Eldridge Monroe had stopped being able to get out of bed on his own. Vernon had moved back to the family ranch in August to care for his father, and the months of July and August and the beginning of September had become a long, slow vigil that was both grief and gratitude, the kind of time that strips everything unnecessary away and leaves only what actually matters. Vernon had brought his tin box with him, with all 51 of Marcella's letters in it, and he had read them again in the evenings while his father slept, not each one twice through but through the whole collection, start to finish. A year's correspondence from a woman he had never properly spoken to, and what he found in those pages, read all together like that, was the most honest portrait of a person he had ever encountered. In the 3rd week of September, Eldridge Monroe had asked for Marcella. She had come on a Tuesday, driving herself out in a borrowed buggy, and she had sat with the old man for 3 hours while Vernon worked on the fence line that needed mending before the winter, close enough to the house to hear if he was needed. He had come in at dusk to find his father sleeping and Marcella in the kitchen, at the old pine table, making coffee with the competence of someone who had been coming to this kitchen for a year. She had looked up when he came in, and for a moment neither of them had spoken, and it was the longest silence between them that had ever been truly mutual rather than one-sided, both of them in it together rather than him silent and her waiting. "He's sleeping," she'd said. "I heard the buggy when you came in," Vernon had said, which was not the most eloquent thing he'd ever thought of but was at least an acknowledgement that he was aware of her existence. "He wanted to see me," she'd said, and then carefully, "he told me things." Vernon had been very still. "What kind of things?" "The kind that explain a lot," she'd said. "About Dodge City, about Hargrove. About why you never—" She had stopped, because they were not having this conversation today, not with his father dying 30 feet away. She had stood up and poured the coffee and brought him a cup with a directness that suggested she was very deliberately not making it mean more than it was. "Drink this. You look like you haven't slept in a week." He hadn't, particularly. He drank the coffee. She had left before dark, and he had stood on the porch and watched the buggy disappear down the road, and it had taken everything he had not to go after her. Eldridge Monroe died on the 1st of October, 1882, with his son holding his hand and the sounds of the autumn prairie coming through the open window. He died as he had lived, with a certain stubborn dignity and a faith that things would work out if given enough time and the right kind of interference. Vernon had buried his father beside his mother in the small family plot at the back of the Monroe property, with a simple stone, and the minister from Caldwell saying the words over them both. And Marcella had been there among the small cluster of mourners, standing a little apart with her gray eyes red-rimmed and her hands quiet in front of her. And she had looked at him across his father's grave with an expression that was not pity, which he could not have endured, but something more complex and more valuable. It was the look of someone who understood loss from the inside and was not asking him to be anything other than what he was in that moment. 3 days after the funeral, Vernon Monroe had sat at the kitchen table in the ranch house where his father had lived for 30 years, and he had written a letter. He had written it 4 times before he had a version he could send. The first 3 drafts he had burned in the stove. The 4th draft he had folded carefully and addressed, and given to the mail rider on Sunday morning without letting himself think too hard about it. Because if he thought too hard about it, he would add it to the pile of burned drafts, and he would be the man in the burning building who couldn't find the door for the rest of his life. What he wrote was this. He told her first about Hargrove, the full account, the fight in Dodge City, the false accusation, the 18 months of legal uncertainty, the reason he had kept his silence. He told her that his lawyer in Wichita had sent him a final letter in September, 3 weeks before his father died, informing him that Dalton Hargrove had withdrawn his witness, and that the matter was formally closed, that there would be no charges, that the thing that had been hanging over him for 2 years was gone. He told her that he had not written to her during those 2 years not because he did not want to, but because he had known from her very first letter that she was someone he could care about profoundly, and Hargrove had already demonstrated a willingness to harm innocents, and he would not make her a target. He told her that he had read every letter she had sent him twice, that he had kept them all in a tin box, that he had read the whole collection again in August while his father was dying, and that by the time he finished the last letter, he understood something with a clarity that had previously eluded him, that the thing he had been protecting her from was not nearly as dangerous as the thing he had been doing to both of them by maintaining his silence. He told her that he was sorry. He told her that he knew he had no right to expect anything from her after a year of silence, that she had been more patient and more honest and more genuinely courageous than anyone he had ever known, and that she deserved an explanation even if she didn't want anything more from him than that. He told her that he thought about her every day, and that the pressed flower from April's letter was between the pages of his almanac, and that he would like, if she was willing, to have a conversation with her. A real one, in person, not through intermediaries and not through silence. That was the letter that had landed on the table between them in the Dusty Rose Saloon, because Marcella had received it on Wednesday and had spent 3 days trying to decide whether to cry or to go directly to the Monroe ranch and have it out with him, and had ultimately decided that she needed to see his face when they talked about it because she had been reading his father's version of his face for a year, and she needed the original. She had sent him a note through the mail rider asking him to meet her at the Dusty Rose on Saturday afternoon, which was the hour when the saloon's owner, Bridget Calloway, kept the bar quiet, and the card players hadn't yet arrived, a civilized hour for an uncivilized conversation. And so they had arrived at the beginning of this story's beginning, which was also its near ending, with Vernon Monroe's hands flat on the bar and Marcella Finley's letter between them, and the word that had stopped her cold still hanging in the air. He had said her name, and she had stopped. She looked at him now, really looked at him, and she saw what she had seen in the letter but hadn't quite let herself believe. That this was a man in genuine pain, not the performing kind, not the kind designed to elicit sympathy, but the real kind that comes from a year of making a choice you believed was right and discovering too late that right and good are not always the same thing. "You should have told me," she said, and her voice was still barely above a whisper. "About Hargrove, about the legal trouble. I was not some fragile thing that needed to be kept away from difficult truths, Vernon. I'm a woman who moved 2,000 miles to a territory where the only person I knew was a manipulative old man I'd never met on the strength of an advertisement. I know how to handle difficult truths." "I know that now," he said. "I knew it by December. By January I knew it absolutely. It didn't change the calculus of what Hargrove would do if he found out about you. And the Hargrove matter is closed now," she said. "Your letter said so. It's closed, as of September 20th. So there's nothing standing between you and an honest conversation except your own stubbornness." Something moved in his eyes that might have been the beginning of a smile, suppressed quickly. "When you put it that way, I tend to put things the way they are," she said. "I know that." His voice had shifted, become quieter and more direct, the professional courtesy stripped away. "Marcella, I have been wanting to talk to you directly since the 3rd week of October last year. I have been wanting to tell you that your first letter was the most unexpected thing I'd received in years, and that your second letter was the one that made me understand you weren't going to give up on this, whatever it turned out to be. I have been wanting to tell you that in August, when I read all your letters together, I sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours after the last one and felt something I don't have a better word for than grateful. Genuinely, completely grateful that you are the person you are." The bar was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped and blew. Bridget Calloway, behind the bar, had found something extraordinarily interesting to study on the far shelf. Marcella looked at Vernon Monroe and felt the anger, which had been her armor for 3 days, beginning to shift and change into something more complicated. She was not ready to let it go entirely, because some of it was still legitimate, and she was too honest to pretend otherwise. But she could feel the shape of what he was telling her, could feel it mapping onto everything she had read between the lines of his silence for a year, and it was making the armor harder to maintain. "Your father told me about Hargrove," she said. "On the Tuesday I came to see him. He told me while you were out at the fence line. He said he wanted me to understand why you'd gone quiet, and he was—" She stopped. "He was very clear that it wasn't because you didn't care. He was very clear that you had read the letters." "He had no right to tell you," Vernon said, "but there was no heat in it. He was dying, Vernon. He was using his remaining time to repair what he'd broken. I thought that was generous of him, honestly, given the original crime." "The original crime," Vernon repeated, and this time the smile didn't get suppressed entirely. "The spectacular original crime of shipping a schoolteacher across 2,000 miles without informing the relevant party," she clarified. "He would have said the relevant party was too stubborn to seek out what he needed on his own. He would not have been entirely wrong," Marcella said. They looked at each other for a moment, and something was happening in the space between them that had been building since October of 1881, since the first letter, since the press flower and the Blue Norther and the school council meeting, and all the other Tuesday evenings and Sunday mornings and winter nights that had been piling up between them like a slow flood. "I don't want you to forgive me because he asked you to," Vernon said. "I want you to know that what I wrote in that letter is the truth. All of it. I should have found a way to tell you sooner. I should have trusted you with the difficulty instead of making the decision for you about what you could handle. That was wrong, and I'm sorry for it." Marcella was quiet for a moment, looking down at the letter between them, then back up at him. "You read every letter twice," she said. "Every one. The one about Thomas Carroway's proposal." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Especially that one." "How many times did you read that one?" A pause. "5." Marcella Finley, who had been raised to believe that dignity required that you not let people see the full extent of what you felt until you were sure of your footing, felt something give way inside her chest that she had been propping up with considerable effort for a year. It gave way quietly and completely, like a final decision being made. "I think," she said, "that you had better buy me a cup of coffee, Vernon Monroe, and then I think we had better have the conversation we should have had 13 months ago." The look on his face when she said that was the first time she had ever seen Vernon Monroe look like something very close to hopeful, and it was, she thought, the most valuable thing she had seen in the entire 13 months she had been in Caldwell, Kansas. They sat at a corner table, and Bridget Calloway brought coffee without being asked, which was the privilege of the woman who owned the most information-rich establishment in any frontier town. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about everything the letters had contained and everything they hadn't, the things too personal or too frightening to commit to paper, the specific shapes of their individual fears, the particular histories that had made them who they were. Vernon told her about his mother, who had died of pneumonia when he was 24, and whose absence had hollowed out the ranch in ways that his father had never fully recovered from. He told her about what it had been like growing up between 2 cattle operations that were always one bad season from open conflict, about learning to read the weather and the range and the intentions of men with the same careful attention. He told her about Dodge City, the full account, including the specific fear that had gripped him in the aftermath when he'd understood how precisely Hargrove had engineered the situation and how vulnerable that had made him. Marcella told him about Cincinnati in a way she had never been able to in the letters, the particular texture of the life she'd left, the way it had felt both safe and suffocating, a city where the shape of a woman's life was drawn for her before she was old enough to evaluate whether she wanted it. She told him about the moment she'd seen the advertisement in the Gazette and felt, for the first time in years, the physical sensation of a door opening. "I knew it was likely to be a disaster," she said. "I knew the odds. Woman travels west on the strength of an advertisement, ends up alone in a frontier town teaching 14 children to read and writing letters to a man who never writes back. There is not a woman in Cincinnati who would have said that was a smart decision." "Was it?" he asked. She looked at him across the table, this quiet, watchful man with his dark eyes and his finally open face. "Yes," she said simply. "It was." They walked out into the late October afternoon together, the main street of Caldwell golden in the slanting light, and Vernon Monroe said, "May I call on you? Properly?" "As should have happened 14 months ago." "You may," she said, "though I'll warn you that my standard for conversation is now informed by 52 letters, so you have a bar to clear." "I read all of them twice," he said. "I know exactly what the bar is." She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and it was exactly what he would have expected from everything she'd put in those letters, full and unguarded and completely real. He came to call on her the following Thursday, because 3 days felt like a reasonable interval, and also he had spent 2 of those days rebuilding the fence on the east pasture, with the energy of a man who needed something to do with his hands while his mind was otherwise occupied. He arrived at the teacher's cottage at 6 in the evening with his hat in his hand, and a somewhat awkward bunch of late-season wildflowers that he had picked from the unplowed ground near the creek. Because the general store in Caldwell did not carry cut flowers, and he had been standing in front of the store for 5 minutes before he decided that picking them himself was more honest than buying something from a jar anyway. Marcella opened the door and looked at the flowers with an expression that was carefully neutral for approximately 1 second, before it softened into something that made him feel like he'd done the right thing. She made dinner, because she enjoyed cooking and had no patience with the social convention that a woman preparing food for a man she had invited to her home was a sign of something other than domestic competence and genuine interest. She made a roasted chicken with potatoes and late-season garden vegetables, And Vernon Monroe ate with the appetite of a man who had been feeding himself ranch hand style for too long, and the manners of a man who had been raised better than that, which was a combination that Marcella found entirely endearing. They talked through dinner, and then through the clearing up, and then they sat in her front room with the lamp burning and the prairie dark outside the windows and talked some more. And it was the easiest conversation Marcella had had since she'd left Cincinnati, because she had been building the vocabulary for it for a year in those weekly letters, and he had been learning it by reading them. He left at 9 because there were certain proprieties of a frontier town that even Marcella respected, and at the door he said, "Same time next week." "Thursday," she confirmed. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and the one after that. By mid-November they were taking Sunday rides together on horseback, Marcella having learned to ride in her first weeks in Caldwell, with the determination she applied to all new skills, and Vernon having discovered that watching her learn something new was one of the most entertaining things he'd witnessed in years, because she approached it with such absolute refusal to be diminished by difficulty. They rode out to the south pasture where the cattle wintered, and he showed her the landscape the way he knew it, not as scenery, but as a working, living system that he understood the way she understood multiplication tables, from the inside out. She asked him questions that showed she was actually listening, and he answered them with more words than he usually used for anything, because she drew language out of him the way the letters had been drawing it for a year, carefully and with genuine interest. There was a particular Sunday in late November, with the prairie gray and cold and the first frost on the grass, when they'd stopped their horses on a low rise and looked out over the Monroe property, and Vernon had said, without preamble, and with the directness that she had identified as his truest register, "I'd like to give you a reason to stay in Caldwell that is better than a one-room schoolhouse." Marcella had looked at him. "Are you proposing to me, Vernon Monroe?" "I'm working up to it," he said, which was so honest it was almost funny. "I wanted you to know the direction of travel first." "I appreciate the advance notice," she said. "I know I've given you a year of silence and then 2 months of catching up," he said. "I know that's not a conventional courtship. Our entire situation has been unconventional since September of 1881, she said. "I don't think convention is a useful standard at this point." He nodded, looking out over the gray and gold of the winter range. "I have a ranch that was my father's and is mine now. It's a working operation, not prosperous but solid, and it will be more prosperous with the kind of management I've been unable to give it for the past 2 years because of the Hargrove situation. I have a house that is too quiet and a kitchen table that I have been sitting at alone for longer than I should have." "Those are facts about your property," she said. "They are not the same as a proposal." He turned to look at her then, directly, the way he had in the saloon when he'd said her name, with that quality of attention that she had come to understand was not something he gave lightly or withdrew easily. "I have been in love with you since some time in January," he said. "I can't tell you exactly when because it was gradual and then all at once, the way things usually are. I know that's a strange thing to tell a woman you've spent a year not speaking to." "It's the most honest thing you've said so far," Marcella said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "Then I'm proposing," he said, "properly and completely and with full knowledge of what I'm asking, which is for you to stay in Caldwell and marry me and let me spend the rest of my life earning back the year I wasted." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the land that had become, over the past year, the landscape of her interior life as much as the literal ground beneath her feet. "Vernon," she said, "yes. I have been in love with you since I pressed that flower in April, possibly earlier. Is that a yes?" "That is absolutely a yes." He leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her for the first time, awkwardly and earnestly and perfectly, and it was, as she thought later, exactly as honest as everything else about him. They were married in December of 1882, in the small church on the north end of Caldwell, with every child from the schoolhouse in attendance, and Ruth Alderman crying in the front pew, and Bridget Calloway having closed the dusty rows for the afternoon on the grounds that this particular wedding was worth temporary business losses. The minister who read the service was the same one who had read the service over Eldridge Monroe's grave 2 months earlier, and Marcella thought there was something right about that continuity, something that honored the complicated man who had started all of this with an advertisement in a Cincinnati newspaper. She wore a dress she had made herself from good blue wool, because that was what was available in Caldwell in December, and because she had her mother's gift for sewing and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Vernon wore his best coat and had gotten his hair cut at last, and the combination made him look like himself but more formal, which Marcella found simultaneously dignified and slightly funny, and the small smile she was suppressing through most of the ceremony was one of the things people remarked on afterward, that the new Mrs. Monroe had smiled through her whole wedding like someone who was in on a joke. She was. The joke was that this whole improbable, ridiculous, painful, wonderful thing had actually worked out. Moving into the Monroe ranch house was an adjustment, though a welcome one. The house was larger than the teacher's cottage and considerably more Spartan, a working man's home rather than a woman's, and Marcella approached its reorganization with the same methodical energy she'd applied to everything else. She did not transform it unilaterally, because it was Vernon's home and she respected that, but she asked about things and proposed changes and listened to his answers, and together they made the ranch house into something that reflected both of them rather than just the history of the Monroe men. She kept the position at the school through the end of the school year, because the children needed continuity, and because she was not the kind of woman who surrendered meaningful work simply because her marital status had changed. Vernon supported this without qualification, which was not something she had taken for granted, and which she added to the growing list of things about him that confirmed the soundness of her judgment. They spent the winter evenings at the kitchen table, which was the heart of the house in the way that kitchens always are, and they talked and read and occasionally argued, and always resolved the arguments before the lamp went out, because they had both spent too much time on the other side of silence to let anything important go unspoken for long. In February, 3 months into their marriage, Marcella discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Vernon at breakfast directly, because she did not know how to tell him any other way. He put down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things very quickly before settling into something that was openly, unguardedly joyful in a way she had not seen from him before. "When?" he asked. "August, I think. Ruth Alderman will know better than I do." He stood up from the table and came to her and put his arms around her with a gentleness that was, she thought, the most eloquent thing he'd ever done. And they stood in the kitchen of the ranch house with the February wind pressing on the windows and the stove warm behind them, and that was enough. That was everything. The baby came in late August of 1883, a boy, arriving in a sweaty, exhausting, magnificent Sunday afternoon with Ruth Alderman attending, and Vernon pacing the porch with the contained energy of a man barely keeping himself in one place. When Ruth came out and told him he had a healthy son, and that Marcella was well and asking for him, he went inside with a swiftness that suggested the porch pacing had been a considerable exercise in self-restraint. Marcella was propped up in the bed with the baby wrapped in a piece of good cotton, and she was tired in a way that went down to her bones, but her eyes when she looked at him were bright and clear. "He looks like you," she said. Vernon looked at his son, this brand new person with his clenched fists and his dark cap of hair and his absolute newborn rage at the world, and felt something shift in the foundation of himself, something that had been uncertain becoming permanently certain. They named him Eldridge James Monroe, Eldridge for the grandfather who had interfered and James for Marcella's father, and Vernon thought his father would have been insufferably smug about it, which seemed appropriate. Eldridge James Monroe was a vigorous and opinionated baby, and his first months were an education in exhaustion that Marcella and Vernon navigated together, with the teamwork of people who had spent the past year learning to trust each other's competence. Vernon was, somewhat to the surprise of the ranch hands, an involved and attentive father, and Marcella caught him on more than one occasion sitting in the kitchen chair with the baby on his shoulder at 2 in the morning, talking quietly about cattle prices and fence conditions in the same tone another man might use for lullabies. "He needs sleep," Marcella said, appearing in the doorway in her nightgown with her hair loose on one of those midnight kitchen occasions. "So do you," Vernon said. "I've got him. Go back to bed. You have to be up for the cattle drive in 5 hours. The cattle will wait 20 minutes. She stood in the doorway looking at this man she had written to for 52 weeks, and who had read every letter twice, who had kept a pressed flower in his almanac, who had proposed on horseback on a gray November morning, with the absolute sincerity of someone who had thought the words over for a long time before he said them. "I love you," she said, which was not something she said casually, because she had learned from her mother that the word love was most valuable when it was reserved for moments that genuinely required it. Vernon looked up at her over the baby's dark head, and the expression on his face was one she had been seeing for the past year in various forms but never tired of, that specific combination of recognition and gratitude that she had learned was his deepest register, the face he made when he was being entirely true. "I love you," he said. "Go to bed, Marcella." She went to bed. He came to bed 20 minutes later, as promised, and the baby slept, and the ranch was quiet around them, and outside the Kansas prairie rolled on under the autumn stars in that enormous, ancient silence that Marcella had written about in her very first letter, the kind of silence that said something she was slowly learning to understand. She understood it now. Spring came again, the third spring since she'd arrived in Caldwell with her 2 trunks and her terrified Hope, and with it came the wildflowers that she had pressed in a letter 2 springs ago, the small blue ones that came up along the creek bank, and she found herself at the kitchen table one morning with Eldridge James in the crook of her arm and a piece of paper in front of her, not to write a letter this time, but simply to note down the date, because she wanted to remember the exact moment the flowers came back. Vernon came in from the morning chores and found her there, and looked at the paper and the pen and the baby and said, "Writing someone a letter." "Noting something down," she said. "What kind of something?" "The flowers are back," she said, "along the creek." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the shelf where the almanac lived and took it down and opened it, and there, between the pages for April, was the pressed flower she'd sent him 2 years ago, still holding its shape, still the color of a clear spring sky. He set it on the table in front of her and said, "I was going to give this back to you eventually." She looked at it for a long moment. "Keep it," she said. "That's where it belongs." He put it back in the almanac and put the almanac back on the shelf. And then he came and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd made before he came in. And he sat down at the table across from her with their son between them. And the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table in the particular golden way of a Kansas spring morning. And Marcella Finley Monroe thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago in Cincinnati, looking at an advertisement in a newspaper and feeling a door open. That woman had made a decision that most people would have called either brave or foolish, depending on their temperament, and she had honored that decision week by week and letter by letter through a year of silence. And the silence had broken at last in the way that long silences do, not with a dramatic moment, but with a single letter arriving in a mailbox on a Wednesday morning. A letter that had said, in careful and honest language, that someone had been reading every word she'd written twice, and keeping it. And that the keeping was a kind of answer, even if the silence hadn't been. She picked up her pen and she wrote, not a letter to anyone in particular, but simply a line for herself at the top of the page. The flowers came back on the 14th of April, 1884. As they do. as things do when you wait long enough and the ground is good. She put the pen down and held her son and drank her coffee, and Vernon Monroe sat across from her reading the almanac with his coffee in his hand and the morning light between them. And outside the Kansas range lay out under the spring sky in every direction, enormous and particular and entirely themselves. The months that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not with extraordinary events, but with the accumulating weight of ordinary ones, each one small but each one adding to the structure of something real and lasting. Marcella continued teaching through the following school year, with the full support of the town council, whose position on her pedagogical methods had solidified considerably since the initial Driscoll controversy, partly because Clara Holt had that autumn won a spelling competition against students from the much larger school in Wichita, and partly because Marcella Monroe was now the wife of a cattle rancher who had considerable standing in the county, and was known for opinions held with the same quiet tenacity as his wife's. Clara Holt turned 15 that year, and Marcella spent considerable private time and effort ensuring the girl had access to more advanced texts and correspondence lessons than the one-room schoolhouse could officially provide, because Clara was exactly the kind of brilliant, overlooked girl who, with the right push at the right moment, could become something extraordinary, and Marcella was not the kind of woman who knew that and did nothing about it. She spoke to Vernon about it one evening, about the injustice of it, this girl with a mind like a fine piece of machinery being directed toward a life that would use perhaps a quarter of her capacity because the world had not yet caught up with what it was losing. Vernon listened to her in the way he listened to things she said with passion, which was with complete and focused attention, and when she finished he said, "What does she want? Not her parents, her. She wants to study. She wants to read law, actually. She told me in confidence. Are there women who do that? There are starting to be, in a few places back east. Then write to them," he said simply, "on her behalf. She's 15. You write the first letter. She writes the second." Marcella had looked at him across the table and thought, as she did regularly, that she had made an extraordinarily good decision in April of 1881 when she had written the first letter. Clara Holt's story was not Marcella's to tell in full, but its beginning was this. A letter sent to a women's college in the East, written in Marcella's clear hand on behalf of a 14-year-old girl in Kansas who wanted to study law, and the response that came back, cautious but not dismissive, asking for a sample of the girl's written work. It was a beginning, and beginnings were enough. In the summer of 1884, Marcella discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Vernon on a Sunday morning ride, pulling her horse to a stop on the same rise where he had proposed, because she liked the symmetry of it, and she knew he would appreciate the symmetry as well. He took it in the same way he had taken Eldridge James's news, carefully and then completely, with that full warmth that was his private register, and that she had the enormous privilege of being one of the very few people who saw it fully. "Another August baby?" he asked. "February, I think." "Winter," he said, which was an assessment of logistical challenge. "Yes," she said. "We'll manage." They managed. February of 1885 brought them a daughter, born in a snowstorm that had half the county shut in, with Ruth Alderman making the drive out to the ranch in a sleigh borrowed from the Alderman stable, and arriving with approximately 20 minutes to spare. The daughter arrived with the same decisive energy as her brother, dark-haired and immediately furious with the world, and Marcella held her in the lamplight of the ranch house bedroom with the snowstorm pressing against the windows and felt, as she had felt with Eldridge James, the particular wonder of a person who had not existed before and did now. They named her Catherine. Catherine Ruth Monroe, the Ruth for the woman who had been Marcella's first friend in Caldwell, and whose steady kindness had been a foundation through both the difficult year and the good ones. Eldridge James, now a year and a half and possessing of strong and specific opinions about everything in his immediate environment, regarded his sister with the solemn assessment of a small scientist confronting unexpected data, and then apparently reached a satisfactory conclusion, because he patted her head with a gentleness that was surprising in a child who was usually running at full speed toward something. Vernon observed this transaction from the doorway of the bedroom and then looked at Marcella with an expression she had no word for, something beyond happiness, something that had to do with a life becoming more than the shape you'd been afraid to hope for. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. "Your letters never mentioned this specific possibility," he said. "I was writing about the present tense," she said. "The future I was leaving open." He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter and his wife and said, with the deliberateness that was his deepest form of sincerity, "I'm glad you didn't close it. I'm glad you finally wrote back," she said. By 1886, the Monroe Ranch had expanded through the acquisition of a neighboring section that had come up for sale when the Pennock family relocated to Colorado, and Vernon had taken on 2 additional hands and a new arrangement for summer grazing that gave the operation a stability it had lacked in the uncertain years before and after his father's death. He was, Marcella noted with satisfaction, a different man from the one who had ridden past her on the main street of Caldwell in October of 1881, not changed in character, but released into his character, the way a room that has been shuttered becomes fully itself again when the windows are opened. She had finished her own transformation as well, or rather, she had completed the one that had been underway since September of 1881, the conversion from a woman who was theoretically capable of belonging somewhere into a woman who actually did. Caldwell was not Cincinnati. It was rougher, louder, more uncertain, subject to the violence of weather and market and human nature in ways that a city's infrastructure partially softened. But it was hers in a way that Cincinnati had never been, hers in the specific sense that she had chosen it and stayed in it and built something real in it with her own hands and her own stubbornness and 52 weeks of letters written on Sunday nights by lamplight. Thomas Carraway, who had proposed to her in July of 1882 and been gently declined, had married a woman from Abilene in 1884, and was quite contentedly running his hardware store with a wife who kept his books and 2 boys who ran in and out of the stockroom after school. And Marcella was genuinely glad for him, because he was a decent man who deserved contentment and had found it, which was the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Dalton Hargrove had relocated to Texas in 1883, which was either coincidence or an acknowledgement that the legal strategy he deployed against Vernon Monroe had failed comprehensively, and that Kansas had become an uncomfortable place for him. Vernon did not discuss it much, because it was a chapter he was more interested in having closed than analyzed, but Marcella noted his posture change the day he told her Hargrove had gone, a specific release of something he'd been carrying so long he'd almost forgot it wasn't permanent. The tin box of letters lived on the shelf in the ranch house study, next to the almanac with the pressed flower. Marcella had found it when they first moved into the house together and had looked at it for a long moment, this battered tin container that held a year of her most honest self, and had decided to leave it exactly where it was. It belonged there. It was part of the history of the place and the people who lived in it, and she was not interested in revising history, only in adding to it. Vernon found her with the tin box open on the desk one evening in the fall of 1886, reading one of the early letters, the one about the Blue Norther in November of 1881. "Which one?" he asked, reading over her shoulder. "The cold one," she said, "3rd week of November." "You described yourself as a Cincinnati woman spectacularly unprepared for the concept of real cold," he said from memory. She looked up at him. "You remember the exact phrasing." "I read it twice," he said simply. She put the letter back in the box and closed it. "Do you know what I think about when I read those early ones now?" "What?" "I think about how frightened I was. Under all the humor and the composure, I was genuinely frightened. I didn't know if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I didn't know if you'd ever speak to me. I didn't know if I'd have the nerve to keep writing if you never answered. But you did, he said. I did. He put his hand on her shoulder, the warmth of it steady and certain. For what it's worth, he said, you are the least frightened person I have ever known, not because you don't feel fear, but because you never let it make your decisions for you. She reached up and put her hand over his. You're going to make me cry, and I never cry. You cried at the school council meeting in May of 1882, letter 34. I did not cry, I had something in my eye. You wrote I may have cried a small and dignified amount. I maintain that is not the same as crying. He laughed, actually laughed, free and genuine, and it was still, after 4 years of hearing it, one of the sounds she valued most in the world. Eldridge James started school in the autumn of 1887, at the same one-room schoolhouse where his mother had taught, though Marcella had by then handed the teaching position to a young man named Louis, who had come from St. Louis and who was, in her assessment, exactly the kind of patient and principled teacher the school needed for the coming years. She was still involved with the school in an advisory capacity, because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving something she cared about entirely alone, but the daily work of it had passed to other hands, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was at peace with that. Her days were full with the ranch and with Catherine, who at 2.5 was demonstrating the same absolute certainty about her own opinions that her mother had displayed at that age, and which Vernon observed with what Marcella identified as a mixture of recognition and mild apprehension. She told the feed store owner his prices were unreasonable. He reported one afternoon, having taken Catherine into town with him while Marcella was managing a mare that had come up lame. She's 2.5, Marcella said. She was very clear about it. What did he say? He gave her a piece of candy and reduced the prices. Marcella laughed. Then she was right. Life on the Monroe Ranch in the late 1880s was not without its difficulties, because life in the West was never without difficulties. The weather was unreliable and the markets more so, and the work was constant and demanding in ways that wore on people. There was a drought in 1887 that cost them 1/3 of the summer range, and a long, hard winter in 1888 that tested every operation in the county. Vernon worked through both with the methodical endurance that was his best quality under pressure, and Marcella was beside him through every decision, not managing or directing but thinking alongside him, as a genuine partner in the enterprise they'd built together. It was during the drought winter of 1888, sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts spread out between them and the lamp burning late, that Marcella said, "We could take a second mortgage on the east section to cover the operating costs, or we could sell the yearlings early and take the lower price." Vernon looked at the numbers. Third option. Neither. What third option? The Pennock section came with a water right we haven't been using. If I can get the ditch cleared before spring, we can irrigate the lower pastures. It won't fix everything, but it'll cut the loss. She looked at him. When did you know about the water right? When we bought the section. You've been saving it. I've been keeping it for the right kind of need, he said. She thought about that, about this man who kept things carefully, letters and almanacs and water rights, who saved things for when they were genuinely needed rather than spending them on lesser needs, who had been doing this with her. She now understood since the very beginning, reading every letter twice and keeping them in a tin box, not because he was cold but because he was careful with the things that mattered to him. Start on the ditch next week, she said. That was always the plan, he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, briefly, the way she did when she wanted him to know that she saw him clearly. They came through the drought year and the hard winter without the second mortgage and without selling the yearlings at the wrong price. The ditch worked. The lower pastures held. The operation survived and in the following year began to recover its footing. By 1890, the ranch was more prosperous than it had been in Vernon's father's time, managed by two people who understood each other completely, and worked with the easy fluency of long partnership. Eldridge James was 7, and already following his father around the property, with the focused interest of a boy who was filing everything away. And Catherine at 5 was learning to ride with the same absolute refusal to be defeated by difficulty that she had apparently inherited from both parents in double measure. It was in the spring of 1890 that Marcella found herself at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, with the lamp burning and the prairie quiet, in exactly the position she had been in October of 1881, when she had written the first letter. And she thought about that woman, the one who had been frightened and brave and stubborn, and who had sat down and written words on a page, because she believed that honest communication was the only real foundation for anything that mattered. She picked up her pen, and this time she wrote not a letter to Vernon, who was sitting across the room reading the newspaper and who she could simply speak to, which was its own daily miracle, but to Eldridge, not their son who bore the name, but to the old man who had started all of this with an advertisement in a Cincinnati paper, and a conviction that his son needed more time and more push than he was giving himself. She wrote to the memory of Eldridge Monroe, sitting in the kitchen of his ranch house, because she had been wanting to say something to him for 8 years, and because some things were worth saying even to someone who was no longer present to hear them. She wrote that she understood now why he had done it, not as an excuse, but as a genuine comprehension she had earned rather than been given. She wrote that she had spent some time furious with him and some time grateful, and had eventually arrived at something more complex than either, a recognition that his interference had been an act of love so specific, and so tailored to the particular needs of the particular people, involved that it was difficult, in retrospect, to entirely condemn. She wrote that he had known things about his son that his son didn't know about himself, and that he had also made a calculated bet on a stranger from Cincinnati, and that both the knowledge and the bet had been correct. She wrote that she hoped, wherever he was, he knew how it had turned out. She folded the letter and did not send it, because there was no one to send it to, but set it on the shelf next to the tin box and the almanac with the pressed flower, because it belonged in that collection of things that had been said carefully and kept faithfully in this house. Vernon looked up from his newspaper and saw what she was doing. He looked at the shelf for a moment, then at her. "For him?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and went back to his paper. Outside, the Kansas spring was doing what it did, coming back in colors that had no names, the wildflowers up along the creek bank and the grass returning green across the range, and the enormous sky going its particular evening colors above all of it. And the 2 Monroe children were asleep in their rooms, and the ranch house was warm and full of the specific quiet of a home where the people in it are where they are supposed to be. Marcella put the pen down and looked around the kitchen that she had walked into for the first time in the autumn of 1882, and that was now as familiar to her as any room she had ever known. The worn surface of the pine table and the iron stove and the almanac on the shelf, and the sound of Vernon turning the pages of his newspaper. And she thought about the 52 Sundays she had sat at a different table in a different town writing letters into silence. And about how silence was not always emptiness, about how sometimes a silence held everything that couldn't yet be spoken, and the speaking was only the end of the waiting rather than the beginning of the meaning. She had written 52 letters. He had read every one of them twice, and on the 53rd Sunday he had written back. That was their whole story in a way. That was the shape of what they were, laid out in its simplest form. A woman who believed that honest words sent into darkness were worth sending. A man who received those words and kept them carefully and read them with the respect they deserved, even in the silence, even when he couldn't answer. And the morning when the silence finally broke, and what was inside it came out into the light and turned out to be, exactly and entirely, love. The lamp burned on in the kitchen of the Monroe ranch house, and outside the prairie went on under the spring stars, enormous and patient and endlessly itself, And Marcella Monroe sat at the kitchen table in the life she had built from one brave decision and 52 Sunday evenings. And it was, as it had always been going to be, exactly enough.